observations I can make here was that the belief in the old Earth at the end of the 19th century was based not because of the best evidence, but in spite of the best evidence. All numerical measures of the age of the Earth and Sun at that time screamed that the age was far less than most scientists wanted. But they ignored that, thinking that there must be some other source for the Sun's energy, some other source for the Earth's internal heat. As it turns out, we later on did find sources for those: nuclear fusion for the Sun and its core, and radioactive decay for the interior of the Earth. That's not my point. Some people at this point say, well, they were wrong. Well, fine, they were wrong, but you're missing my point. My point is, at the time, based upon the data they had, the quantitative measurements flatly contradicted the majority opinion concerning the age of the Earth. Ergo, evidence had nothing to do with it. That's my point. The great age at that point was based entirely upon the assumption of evolution. Again, I want to be very clear. I know that we have a different theory and understanding of the source of the Sun's heat and the source of the Earth's internal heat today. But that's not the point. The point is people persisted in an incorrect belief beyond the age the limits could be given at that time, merely because their presuppositions were wrong, I am convinced. Now, has the situation changed much today? People believe the Earth is 4.5 billion years old. They believe the universe is 13.8 billion years old. They claim this based upon some measurements of data, but a lot of that belief already preceded that data. The belief in great age did. And so again, I don't think the situation's changed. They trumpet and they marshal up these different quantitative measurements, but I don't think that that's really getting to the point of the question. And again, I want to reiterate that creation account in Genesis 1, it's very clear it's talking about the miraculous. And again, God, I'm not limiting God by saying it had to be 6 days, not too long ago, because God has limited himself. He has told us, revealed to us in the Bible that how long this took. Now, you could argue, some people argue, well, the Bible, we take two approaches to this question, two ways. One, we could start with the Bible, and the other one, we can start with what people think science is. Now, already there's a little bit of a shifting argument going on here. It's almost as if the Bible and the science are similar things in some way. Well, they're not. Science is a human-inspired way of how we go about trying to study the natural world around us, and we don't argue with most of science. If you sit down and start thinking about the discipline of science, there's very little we would quibble with. I taught physics for many years, and there really wasn't much of anything there I could argue with in physics. Whether you're an evolutionist, an atheist, a Christian, a theist, a Bible-believing Christian, a creationist, doesn't matter. Physics is physics. When you get into astronomy, my primary discipline, much of that doesn't depend either. There's a lot of descriptive astronomy, a lot of operational astronomy, if you will, based on what we see around the world right now. And then there's this historical aspect, and I had very little to quibble with there. In the years I taught astronomy at the university, there was relatively little that I taught that I disagreed with. When I did get to evolutionary ideas, and yes, I did teach them in my classrooms, I also felt free to critique those ideas. I often said anybody that came out of my second semester of my astronomy class believing the Big Bang must have not been paying attention in my class. All right, again, we sometimes talk about the fact that there are two types of science, and a lot of the critics, a lot of the evolutionists don't like this, but I think it's very appropriate. We have what some of us call operational science. That's a science of the here and now. It's based upon what we see around the world. And then there's historical science, or if you will, origin science, people talk here. It's talking about past processes. It's like forensic science. You know, you can put together this theory about what have happened in the past, but how can you, short of a time machine, how can you actually go back into the past and test to see if that's exactly what happened? The rules of the understanding and testing these two approaches are very different from one another. I won't say that historical science is illegitimate. I'll simply say that it's very different. Sometimes people will say disbelieving evolution is like disbelieving gravity. And that's nonsense. We can make up different theories of gravity. In fact, people do that. And you can go into the lab and test those different theories. In fact, there are experiments going on right now that do that. And you can then figure out which theory is supported by the evidence and which ones are eliminated by the evidence. But you can't really do that with origin science. You can take the evidence as it exists, say fossils existing in the present, and try to deduce what might have happened in the past to explain those. That's the way historical science works, but it doesn't tell you exactly what happened. You can't test the same way. So we'll say that the Bible is not a science book, and I happen to agree. But you know what, folks? We're not necessarily talking so much science here. We're talking about history, and the Bible is a history book. The first 5 books are clearly historical books. The Pentateuch, plus you've got 12 more, giving you a total of 17. But hold on a minute. You've got the prophetic books, and they contain a tremendous amount of history in each of those. And then you go to the poetic books. One of them, Job, is a historical book as well, told in a poetic form. So already all but 4 of the Old Testament books are history. And then you have the Gospels and the book of Acts and the New Testament. They take a bulk of that. Those are history books. Many of the epistles contain historical clues as well. Book of Revelation, well, I'll leave it up to you to decide how much of that is history. Okay, that's a big debate I don't want to go to there. My point is this: the Bible is a book of history. If we're going to talk about the history of the world, then as a Christian, it behooves us to start with the Word of God. So the length and age of creation, again, I keep repeating myself, but it's very important. I do believe the creation week was 6 normal days. The genealogies and chronologies suggest a little over 6,000 years. And again, the question leading up to the conclusion of my introduction is, can we find evidence of this? And the answer, I think, is yes. Okay, we have here an image of the moon, and some of the stuff people earlier in the week have mentioned, so I'm going to go